Good evening, everyone. Welcome.
Hi.
I see several folks just coming in. There will be a mass exodus after a short video, and there will be plenty of room, so come on in. We're so glad you're here. Friends, I'm delighted to welcome all of you this evening and to introduce you to our speaker, the final speaker in our Lenten series, celebrating the spiritual disciplines for Lent. Shane Claiborne is with us this evening. He is a prominent speaker, activist, and best-selling author. I hope you noticed he has a table of books outside the door, and we have folks who are ready to help assist you if you would like to purchase one or more of those on your way out. Shane worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta. He founded The Simple Way in Philadelphia. He leads a group called Red Letter Christians, a movement of folks who are committed to living as if Jesus really meant the things he said. If you have a red letter Bible, you know those are the ones Jesus said, right? These folks take those words quite seriously, and we have a lot to learn from that movement. Shane is a champion for grace, which has led him into prisons advocating for the homeless and places like Iraq and Afghanistan to stand against war. Now grace fuels his passion to end the death penalty and to help stop gun violence. I have a list of his books here, but you can see a list of his books sitting on the table outside. Common Prayer for Ordinary Radicals is a personal favorite, and there are a couple of copies of that out there. His books have been translated into more than a dozen languages. He speaks over 100 times a year nationally and internationally. His work has appeared in Esquire, Spin, Christianity Today, Time, The Wall Street Journal, and he's been on all sorts of television shows, given academic lectures around the world. We are so delighted to have you with us this evening, Shane. Come on forward. I'm going to give you this one for the recording.
Oh, okay.
A couple of places we can put it right there. I think that will work. This one, if you can clip on.
Okay.
Maybe up higher. That's
I'm
great.
going to tell you that I'm really excited to be here, and we're going to do something before the young people dip out, which is, there's a little video, but just to give you the context for it, I'm really convinced that one of the reasons that we're losing a lot of young people in the church is not because we've made the gospel too hard, but because we've made it too easy. That sometimes we've reduced Christianity to just a set of doctrines, and I think that Jesus actually came to give us a vision for transforming the world. And the things that we're talking about, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, are pretty radical ideas. And so this is a young person I met on the road. And I don't know what y'all would do if you won $50,000 on a game show, but this is what he does. So this is a buddy of mine, Mark Weaver. You can check this out.
While I was in California, I started reading The Irresistible Revolution by Shane Claiborne. So my brother Rick, he sent me a copy of the book. And as I was reading it, I was totally inspired. And I was feeling convicted inside living in one of the richest communities in America, in Orange County, California. And I was part of these mega churches. I wasn't living as selfless as I could be. And would you really give all your possessions away, sell them to the poor, and follow me? And I was challenged and convicted, would I really do something like that? But I kind of shrugged it off. I was like, well, I really don't even have any possessions. But the next day, some of my friends came to visit me from Indiana and California, and they wanted to go get on the show The Price is Right. We got in line, and they actually called my name up. And Mark Weaver, come on!
The actual retail price is $14.49. Mark, you're a winner.
60, Bob.
60. He's going to try 60. We're looking for the back of the car in there. $17,260. I'll shake the hand of a winner. You have to beat 85 cents to get into the showcase, and you did it. You will be in the showcase at the end of the show.
With this new range. Brand new convertible. $2,000 in prizes. I won 2 cars, a trip for 2 to Paris, a stove, and a rug. It was really cool. But then I remembered the words that Shane wrote in his book, so I decided to sell the 2 cars that I won on the show right back to the dealership. And I used the money to fly to Uganda, Africa, and I just decided to live in orphanages for a while and just give all the money away to them.
The orphanage Mark lived in is for children who lost their parents to AIDS. For each one of these beautiful children here, 2 people died from the AIDS epidemic.
Nothing ever felt better than to just give away the money rather than to keep it and get something for myself. I've never been without a meal. I've never been without a shirt on my back. Stuff like that is the least I could do. And if everybody gave a little bit like that, I think this world would be a better place.
We'll be right back.
So, yeah. And so as you all, the young folks, are going to dip out, but I want to say, remember that Jesus was just over 30 years old when he died. And it was a youth movement. So you all keep imagining what it means to follow Jesus. So we'll see y'all. And now there's seats for some of y'all. Come on up. Are you hearing me okay? Is that working? Yeah, okay. So we're talking about simplicity, and I'm going to get a few pictures up in a minute here that I'm going to show you. My wife says if you see my screen on my laptop, you understand my brain, so sorry.
I can never unsee that.
Yeah, sorry to do that. So we're talking about simplicity, and I wanted to start by reading the words of Søren Kierkegaard, one of our great philosophers, Danish philosopher. He said this: "The matter is quite simple. The Bible is very easy to understand, but we Christians are a bunch of scheming swindlers. We pretend to be unable to understand it because we know the minute we understand, we're obliged to act. Take any words of the New Testament and forget everything except pledging yourself to act according to them. My God, you will say, if I do that, my whole life will be ruined. How would I ever get on in the world? Well, herein lies the real place of Christian scholarship." I like this part. "Christian scholarship is the church's prodigious invention to defend itself against the Bible, to ensure that we can continue to be good Christians without the Bible getting too close. Oh, priceless scholarship, what would we do without you? Dreadful it is to be in the hands of the living God. It's dreadful enough to be alone with the New Testament." So I thought that was good to get us going tonight. Yeah, I think it was Mark Twain that said, "It's not the parts of the Bible I don't understand that disturb me. It's the parts of the Bible I do understand that disturb me. Those parts like sell what you have and give it to the poor." And I can remember, as we think about simplicity, one of my inspirations and friends for a little bit while he was alive was Rich Mullins, who was a singer and songwriter. Do any of you know that name? Oh, yeah. Rich Mullins. He wrote a lot of songs that I'm not going to hurt your ears, but by trying to sing them. But he wrote a lot of great songs. And what you may also know is that he became very popular, but he lived in a little bitty place on a native reservation, and he capped off his income I think it was like $19,000 or something, to live off of the similar income as to the folks that he was living in their community. And all the rest of the money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, he wanted to see given away. And he spoke at Wheaton College when I was there, which is, evangelical school outside of Chicago. And I'll never forget when he came to chapel at Wheaton, he said, to this evangelical audience, he said, you guys are all into the born again thing. And he goes, that's awesome. We need to be born again. Jesus says that to a guy named Nicodemus. You need to be born again to enter the kingdom of God. And he says, but if you tell me I've got to be born again to enter the kingdom, I can tell you you've got to sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Because Jesus said that to one guy too. And it got really awkwardly quiet. He was never invited back. But anyway, he said, but that's why God invented highlighters, so we can highlight the verses that we like and ignore the other ones. And I think, what Rich kind of pushed me, and I think many of us to do, is just to really say, what if Jesus meant the stuff he said, especially with this idea of simplicity? What does it look like to love our neighbor as ourselves? And because I think context matters, I promise we'll get into the idea of simplicity a little bit more, but I want to bring you a few images of my context, because I think when I think of what it looks like to live simply, a lot of my ideas have been shaped by the neighborhood that I'm in. And as one pastor I heard say, where you sit determines what you see, right? And in many ways, who our neighbors are, that impacts what it means to love our neighbor, right? Because when we're loving our neighbor and they live off the same economics as we do, or have more stuff than we do, then it redefines what simplicity is. But when our neighbors are, in a cardboard box, or they're in an abandoned house, loving our neighbor is really challenging, as some of you know, I was really formed by Mother Teresa too, and I lived in India with her for a little bit, and not like in her house, but in India, and I spent every day volunteering there for a summer, and it was told to me that Mother Teresa kind of had everything that she owned in a box, and the sisters, many of them slept on the floor, and that's where I slept some of the time that I was there. And then we lived in a little place across the street, and but they didn't have hot water, and I thought, that's a little different. And then one day, the nuns were talking to us, and they said, it's not that hot water's bad. It's just that many of our neighbors don't have water at all. And so it keeps us sensitive to the suffering. Just to have a cold shower. It's uncomfortable, and you're like, dadgummit, why don't I have hot water? And yet, you're constantly reminded that we got neighbors that are having a lot worse than we do. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have hot water. I've got hot water. I'm just going to put all my cards on the table. But I'm saying, like, when we fast from food, when we do these spiritual disciplines that you all have been talking about, some of it is to sensitize us to the suffering, right? And I want to start, as we talk about simplicity, by saying that simplicity to me is most meaningful when it's rooted in love, right? And anchored in love. It's not just an asceticism. It's not just some kind of socialism, or that everything we got to share. I think it's got to be driven by love to be most powerful. And I'll just tell you one more India story, which is that there were kids that were living on the street, 8 years old, 10 years old, homeless, and Mother Teresa, knew these kids are very precious to God, but they haven't always been convinced of that. So we get to convince them of that and remind them of that every week. And so every week we would have a street party for these kids. And 100 of them would show up. We'd have a beautiful meal like you had here tonight. We'd play games, and that's where I came in. I like games, and so we would do all these different things. And I eventually became kind of helped organize those Tuesday night banquet feasts for the kids on the street. And there was two kids actually, that they were brothers, and they were maybe like 10 years old, and they were homeless. And I had spent a lot of time with them. I was actually trying to find a family that would adopt them. And so anyway, one of the kids comes up to me and goes, "It's my birthday." And you could just see his whole countenance sink. You got Mother Teresa on your Time magazine there, don't you? His heart just sunk. And then he looked up at me, and I thought, okay, it's his birthday. You know, the nuns had really strict orders that you can't do for one kid. Don't play favorites. You can't get one kid a present if you can't get 100 of them a present. So I got all that in theory, right? But then, like, it's his birthday. So I decided I'm going to sneak off and get this kid a little something, right? And I brought him back an ice cream cone. What I didn't think through is how long it had been since he had ice cream, right? And so he gets this ice cream cone, and he's just absolutely stunned. And he holds it, and he's like, and then his impulse is, this is too good to keep for myself, right? He yells at all the other kids, and he goes, "We've got ice cream!" And he lines them up, and he goes, "Everybody's going to get a lick!" And he goes down the line, I kid you not, and he gives every kid a lick of the ice cream. This is before COVID. And he looks full circle to me, and he's like, we saved you a lick too, Shane. And I'm like, awesome. I got this whole spit phobia thing. But I went for it. And I think that is one of the best lessons on economics, right? That it's not about how bad the stuff is, it's about how good it is, that you just want to make sure everybody gets a lick. And so often we receive the gifts of God and we kind of hoard them for ourselves rather than our impulse being, we want to make sure we share this. As the great Dorothy Day once said, the best thing to do with the best things in life is give them away. And so that's where I'd like to start, because I think you can talk about simplicity and it can feel really like a heavy burden. You feel guilt and shame and all this stuff. And I want to say, I don't think Jesus came to give us guilt to the fullest. Jesus came to give us life to the fullest. And sometimes the kids understand it better than we do, right? That we need to hold the gifts of God with open hands. So that's been my kind of backdrop in thinking about economics, is that it's about love. Simplicity is about living with a little less so that others can have everything that they need. And as Gandhi once said, there's enough for everyone's need, but there's not enough for everyone's greed. And so if we're going to love our neighbor as ourselves, it affects the way that we hold our possessions. And so this is my neighborhood. I thought I'd just give you a little context, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the economics and the simplicity. Because it's not just about money either, but choosing a way to live that's rich and full, and that means turning off some of the TVs and screens and stuff. So this is our life. Our community started, I grew up in East Tennessee, and I went to Philadelphia to go to college. And when I was in my second year of undergrad, there were a group of homeless families. There was a group of homeless families that had no place to go, and there were 3,000 families on the waiting list for housing. So there was a 10-year waiting list for housing, and many of the shelters were also full. And so they moved into this abandoned Catholic church building, and this had been abandoned for years. And they started living there, and this is where everything shifted for me. I read about it in the newspaper with my college friends, and it told the story of how there were about 100 people living there, mostly women and children. There were probably 30 kids that were living in there, and they had nowhere else to go. And so what the newspaper article said was that the Catholic Church had responded by saying that they were trespassing on church property, even though the building had been abandoned for years. And it said if they aren't out within 48 hours, they could be arrested for trespassing. And that's one of those moments where, as good evangelicals, we had a prayer meeting, right? And then there's kind of those prayer meetings where you go, God, we need you to do something. And you kind of hear God say, I did do something. I made you get down there, and that's what we did. And we went to that cathedral, and on the front of the cathedral, the families had hung a banner that said, how can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? How can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? The families were amazing organizers. I mean, they welcomed us into their life, and nothing's been the same for me since. But they also were women of deep faith and men of deep faith, and so they held press conference. And they said, we want to be very clear, we mean no disrespect to the Catholic officials or the archdiocese. But we've talked to the real owner of this building, your boss, the Lord Almighty. And God said, the widows and the orphans matter. God said we can stay. And so they stayed. And I have to say, one thing happened after another. You know, I've written a lot about it, but it was that transformative experience where in there, this was where our vision for what it means to be the church was kind of birthed out of, ironically, you know, the kind of abandoned church space. And we read about the early church in the book of Acts. And that's also what inspired us, right? As you know, as the Holy Spirit fell on the early Christians at Pentecost, and not only did they speak in tongues, foreign tongues, but they began to share everything they had. It says no one claimed any of their possessions that were their own, but they shared everything they had. In fact, it says the offerings were put at the feet of the apostles, and then it was distributed to folks as they had need. And we saw that, and we said, man, that was a really radical way of living, you know, to live with that kind of vision of none of our possessions are our own. So we ended up moving into the neighborhood, and oh, by the way, that's my wife who couldn't come with me this time, but I'll bring her next time for sure. But she's we got married in the old cathedral, and we got permission because that would have been a bad wedding crasher, you know. But my tuxedo is made. My mom made it, and I like making clothes, so you'll see a trend of that. That part of simplicity for me is just learning to make things again, right? Learning to sew and to grow food and to can sauerkraut and to, you know, some of those arts that we've almost lost. So that was our wedding, and then this is our neighborhood, which is that's me and Katie. Right, that's our stretch limousine at our wedding party. So got the cans going behind it, and that's our neighborhood, which is made of row houses that are, you know, all very. It's really densely populated, but community comes and really flourishes there. So even though it's economically poor, it's community rich because the community is resilient. It's how we've survived. If you've spent time in neighborhoods that are economically poor, you've probably seen that the community is often very rich. And the opposite's true, I think, sometimes too, that neighborhoods that are economically rich are often community impoverished, don't know their neighbors, can feel very lonely, and even though we kind of have all the stuff we need, you know. So I've learned community here, and I've also learned to be content with what we have, because there's always someone that has less. I mean, we've got neighbors that still don't have running water. You know, we've got neighbors that are living in abandoned houses, and so we're trying to restore that neighborhood together and figure out. Our vision is to live in a neighborhood that we're proud to call home, and to say, what would it look like if God's dream came on our block? And so that's what we're doing. So we've got a lot of abandoned buildings and abandoned spaces, but we like to bring them back to life. And for us, you know, kind of life and community happens in the neighborhood and on the block. And a lot of what we do is pretty simple. I mean, as we think about simplicity, it's thinking about what it looks like to get on the sidewalk and get to know neighbors, to create things like a tool share where not everybody needs a lawnmower, not everybody needs a washer and dryer, so let's figure out how to create community spaces together. Let's create a way that we can learn from each other. So this is a group of folks that are all in recovery from substance addictions. And I'm convinced that sometimes we overthink some of the ministries of the church, and some of the simplest ministries have been the most effective and productive in our world, where I like Henry Nouwen's vision that we're wounded healers, right? So the things that we've survived are not our liabilities to be ashamed of. They're actually our credentials that equip us to be wounded healers. It's out of, you know, our scars become the things that then allow us to reach out with others. So the best folks to help someone coming off heroin is someone that's been sober for a couple of years or 10 years or 3 weeks. And so that we're walking together. The best folks to help women coming out of domestic violence are women who have survived domestic violence. So we're walking with one another. And I think the church has a lot to learn from the the simplicity of AA and other recovery communities. I mean, some people are more familiar with the 12 steps than the key principles, but some of the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous and NA and others is that you don't have buildings, you don't own real estate, you don't have paid staff. It's all a fellowship of wounded healers. They don't take big donations from anyone because they might have too much power in the organization. You don't have a centralized spokesperson. So if you think about a lot of the things that are kind of the cause of some of the funk in the church, I mean, we could learn a lot from that. So we really love that community. And then, we do meals together. We do celebrations together. I think that's our Mother's Day celebration. So, for almost every month, we've created like a liturgy in the neighborhood, right? So there's something that pulls us together. This is our back to school party, where some of these are before COVID. Obviously, we've had to pivot and rethink things a little bit. But, we'll have 1,000 kids that come together and they get blessed in different languages from all kinds of different clergy and faith leaders in the neighborhood, and we have fun to go back to school because it's not really easy to get excited to go back to school. So we make that the big day of the year, And we had a 2-story water slide with liability insurance, and and we have street performance. This is one of the great days in our neighborhood where we a lot of times what's in the news about Kensington is not good news. So we said we need some good news stories in Kensington. So we're going to set a Guinness Book of World Record on Potter Street. And our block's not always known for good things. So my buddy, Josh Horton, he's the best juggler in the world. And he decided to come and set the world record. Are you ready for this? For the most apples sliced in 1 minute while juggling machetes. And he did it. So, but there's some of those things just like, there's things like joy and community and life that we've got to recapture, I think, and get out of our screens and out of our, carefully post-COVID, but I think we're longing for community. We're made to love and be loved. And so some of this is not rocket science. It's just trying to figure out how do we exercise muscles that have atrophied a little bit, right? How do we get to know neighbors? How do we create celebrations? How do we get the church out of buildings and into the streets? Because one of the things that we've never done in 20 years is a Sunday worship service. Because we decided there's Sunday worship services everywhere. And that's awesome. I love going to worship on Sunday. But we said we're going to go to our local churches on Sunday. But the question we're asking is, what does it look like to be the church on Monday and Tuesday and every other day of the week? So we're trying to figure that out and flesh that out, right? So, some of what we're doing now is we've taken abandoned houses and we're turning them into homes again, and we're doing it, as a neighborhood. So I'm going to whip through some of these so we have plenty of time to talk. But this is a abandoned house. We've gotten some of them for as cheap as $1. So we didn't even have to do a big fundraiser for that dollar. And then this is the before and after of that. So yeah, it's pretty sweet. So it costs us like $30,000, and we do 0 interest mortgages. We customize the family's house payment, so it's usually about $400 a month, and we sell houses for $35,000. So everybody's wanting to move to Philly now. But anyway, that's how we do it. So and some of that is looking at how other folks have done it and creating housing that's affordable. And we're doing gardens too. So this is an abandoned lot that we turned into a vegetable garden. And even the flowers there are made of hubcaps. That we got a lot of abandoned tires, bless them. And this was a really tough season for our neighborhood where one of the abandoned factories burnt down our block, and our whole neighborhood came together and we rebuilt that block. So this is right after the fire. The house I was living in burnt down. 100 families were displaced by the fires. 7 alarm fires, big as they get. And then this is just a few years later, we had rebuilt it, and we built some new housing, but we also built these gardens. And now we're growing stuff there. We're painting murals. That's a Banksy counterfeit that we redid. And, 2 little kids standing on a pile of guns and bombs and stuff. And so And then I'll show you one because there's one that, this is our most theological one. You know, it's got the lion, the lamb, and the dove, the rolled away stone, the street resurrection party. The kids did all the pastels, and then we superimposed the greens. It's pretty awesome. And, you know, everything's a learning curve. Like we learned in this one that painting a mail container is a federal crime. Who knew? But yeah, it turned out okay. They were gentle with us. But anyway, so we're growing food. We're experimenting with like what it looks like to grow, you know, our own food around in our space. And one of my neighbors said, one of the best articulations of it, she said, we're trying to bring the Garden of Eden to North Philadelphia. And that's the vision, right? It's a very simple vision of like, what does it look like to try to ask, what is God's dream for Dallas? What's God's dream for your neighborhood? What would it look like if God's dream came true on your block or in your area? So we're doing aquaponics gardening now. We're trying to do like fish underground and plants on top, and it works good most of the time. Harvesting Swiss chard and sharing it with neighbors, and it's joy. So that's our prayer on the front door, is heal all that is broken in our hearts, in our streets, and in our world. It's kind of a simple prayer, but it's also a prayer that I think recognizes that God's salvation is personal, but it's also social. It's healing what's broken in our world and in our streets. And so as we think about economics, I just want to say a little bit more, and then I'm going to open it up for dialogue and we'll talk together, is that joy of trying to love our neighbors, I think fundamentally it's about knowing our neighbors, right? And I'm convinced that one of the big obstacles in the church when it comes to the inequity between the rich and the poor is not just a compassion problem, but it's a proximity problem. It's a relational disconnect, right? That it's not that we don't care about the poor, it's that we don't really know them. Mother Teresa said it can be very fashionable to talk about the poor, but not as fashionable to talk to the poor and with the poor. And we're really to try to live into relationships that cross cultural and economic barriers. And so I think one of the most radical things that the church should be is a place where we don't have rich and poor anymore, where we have family. And that's what I think, is symbolized in the Eucharist as well. Paul, really scolds the early church in the book of Corinthians. And I learned about that as like one version of that is that you're coming to the communion table without dealing with the sin in your heart. But if you read carefully, it was actually, part of it was about economics. Paul says that some of you are coming to the communion table overly fed, and others of you are coming to the communion table hungry. And it's a desecration of the Lord's feast. If some of us have more than we need while some of us have less. Of course, he also says, this is Paul in a different part of Corinthians saying, if the one who will gather won't gather too much, then the one who can only gather little won't have too little. So that vision that we're not going to have more than we need while someone else has less. I mean, I think it's a simple vision, but it's so challenging. You think of John the Baptist as he's preaching, repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. He's also saying, if you've got 2 tunics, give one away. That's what John was teaching. If you've got 2 tunics, give one away. And it was the ethic of the early church that if we have more than we need while someone else has less, then we've stolen it. If we have an extra coat in our closet while someone's cold, we have stolen that coat. It belongs to the one who's naked on the streets. Vincent de Paul, who the great charity is named after, he said, when I give food to the hungry, I get on my knees and I ask for forgiveness because I'm only returning what was taken. The vision, of John Wesley, he said, if I should die with more than 10 pounds, may every person call me a liar and a thief because I've betrayed the gospel and betrayed the poor. I was talking to the Methodist bishops and I said, I guess the question is, if John Wesley was alive, would he be Methodist? And like 3 of the bishops loved that joke. But anyway, Sure. John Wesley said, if I have money in my hands, I get rid of it as quick as I can before it corrupts my heart. So I think that some of this is really about what does it look like to really live into that vision of love and to the idea that God created enough. As the proverb says, give me neither poverty nor riches, right? For in my poverty, I might be forced to steal, and in my riches, I might forget my God. So that vision that I invite us to think about when it comes to simplicity is a theology of enough. That there is enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. And in a world right now where we've got the deepest inequity that we've ever seen in history, literally less than 100 people now own the same amount as half the world's population. Over 3 billion people. Less than 100 of the richest people still own that much wealth. You start to say, this is a very fragile world, right? Where masses of people are living in poverty at the same time as a handful of people have more than they can ever imagine. Where 3 people own the same amount as 50 countries combined. Mind-boggling inequity, right? So the vision of this day, our daily bread, is a beautiful vision of enough. And finally, I think, going back to this is old stuff, some of it, right? That when the Hebrew people, when the Israelites are being led out of their captivity in Egypt, first of all, you remember what they were making, right? Back in Egypt. You remember that? Yeah, bricks. For what? For the storehouses, it says, of Pharaoh, right? They're building bricks to hold the surplus of the empire while they can't even feed their own kids, right? And that's the world that we live in, right? Where we've got people that are catering banquets that they can never afford to eat at. Where we've got people that Michael Jordan at one point was making more money just advertising and putting his name on Nike shoes than all of the kids combined in all of the sweatshops that were making his shoes. So the inequity, it's everywhere, right? That we see. So, but then as God's leading the Israelites out of captivity, they start to get hungry, right? And God hears feels their hunger, responds to their hunger by pouring down manna from heaven. But then it's interesting, Exodus 16, right? Where God says, do not take more than you need. If you take more than you need, God says, I'm going to send maggots to eat it up. I think it's a good thing that maggots can't get into banks, because I think we might have some storehouses but that we're not to take more than we need. They're even told to take an omer, 1 day's ration, in the Ark of the Covenant, to travel with it, to remember to live simply, so that there would be enough for everyone. So that vision is about economics, but I think it's also about us being free of all the stuff that we hide behind, right? Mother Teresa said, the more we have, the more we hide behind. And she was notorious for saying at an Ivy League convocation, she said, I've never seen such poverty as I see here. Because even among the toughest places in India, a lot of the folks, they have each other. They carry each other, even in their poverty and desperation. But here, in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, we have some of the deepest poverty because we're lonely. We have all this stuff that we hide behind. And in some of the richest countries in the world, we have the highest rates of loneliness, depression, suicide. And you start to say, what does real life look like, right? And I think it's that vision that Jesus has lived like the lilies and the sparrows. That's what real freedom looks like. If we can't hold our possessions with open hands, then they possess us. And they begin to own us. And so Jesus is teaching us to be free. An economy that's not just good news to the poor, but it's good news to folks that have hid behind all of their stuff. And I think finally, that story Jesus told of the rich man and Lazarus, which was about a man that lived in a gated world, lived in a gated neighborhood, lived in a comfort and luxury, as Jesus said. And there was someone suffering on the other side of the wall. Come on, somebody, I know I'm in Texas. Someone suffering on the other side of the wall. And they both die, the beggar, Lazarus, and the rich man. And it says the rich man is separate from God, and Lazarus, his name means the one God rescued. Lazarus is next to God. And you get the sense that this man thought he was locking himself into a safe world, a secure world, but he had locked himself into hell. That literally the wall he had built not only separated him from the suffering of the world, but it separated him from God. The wall separated him from God. It wasn't good for the rich man or the poor man. We are meant to be free, and we are meant to love and be loved. It's what we're made for. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening. And we've got... I was very careful to make sure we left a little time for dialogue. We've got a solid 15 or 20 minutes, so does that sound good? I don't know if how we want to do it. Do you want to just talk real loud and I'll repeat it for the...
I think we've got a microphone that
Oh,
travels
okay,
around
great.
for the recording.
Okay.
And if people can't hear the question in the room, you can repeat it.
Okay,
So
cool.
I'll carry the microphone. Anybody have a question or a comment? Yeah, Sarah.
Can I see your magazine here?
Oh, sure, let me
Yeah,
show
wait,
you.
you,
So
what
I'm in
did
the
your,
middle. I'm in the
what
middle
is
of
your
talking
autograph?
over here, and they have a little Mother Teresa. Is this a recent one?
No, that was like.
Oh, you brought it. It was just lovely.
Autograph.
I don't know why. I might get something might happen if I sign Mother Teresa.
So, in this wonderful country we love and we hold so dear, we think of America as a democracy. But it seems, and I have elderly parents who remember the World War II very well and the sacrifices people made so willingly with no whining. It seems today that we live not in a democracy, but a meritocracy, where we are, and we all have great friends who believe this, we ourselves at times, that the poor don't work hard enough, that the poor don't earn their way. And this meritocracy idea is born from that only by merit do we earn our place in society. Mm-hmm. And there's a big downside to that, of course. Your thoughts on that?
Wow. Okay. Well, thanks for your thoughts. I guess my first thought was I think some of us don't. And I was one of those. For a lot of my life, I didn't realize that we're born into different social locations, different social positions. And I heard one great definition of privilege, which is that privilege is being born on third base and acting like you hit a triple. Being born on third base and acting like you hit a triple, right? And I think that what we often have is folks that are saying you just need to work hard and don't recognize that we have 200, 300, 400 years of pre-existing conditions of racism and inequity and what we've done to certain groups of people that we've never healed the wounds of. And so I think of the study that came out this week of the Poor People's Campaign of my brother, Bishop Reverend Barber and Liz Theo Harris released a study that showed how disproportionately COVID impacted communities that are impoverished. Whether they're rural or urban, West Virginia or North Philadelphia, between 100 times the impact. So, it's been said that when America catches a cold, poor folks catch pneumonia. And I think that's part of what we see is that there are folks who were born on third base and others that weren't, and we act like we all have the same opportunities. And there's certainly studies that show Freakonomics studies that show this, right? That systemic injustice is real, and y'all are wrestling with that. Critical race theory has become a culture war that's a way of trying to avoid the stuff we really need to be talking about. And Freakonomics shows that, I don't even want to talk about critical race theory. I want to talk about the fact that sin impacts systems and structures, right? That even in the Freakonomics study, what they did was they gave identical resumes to employers. I don't know if you saw this. The only thing that was different on the two resumes was the name. Identical resumes given to employers. On one, it had the name Shannon. On the other, it would have the name Shaniqua. On one, it had the name Matthew. And on the other, it had Mohammed. And you saw that Jason gets the job over and over and over, and Jamir does not get the job. That we see that even whether it's implicit or explicit, we have these biases that are coming from hundreds of years of racism that has a legacy and a residue that we have to affirm what history has not affirmed. So it is race, it's class, but I think it's all those things. And that's why I think, being able as a church to affirm that Black Lives Matter is saying I think of that verse in Corinthians where it says we're all one body, right? With many parts. When one of us suffers, all of us suffer. But it ends by saying, the parts of the body which have been dishonored are given special honor. Woo! My friend Alexia Salvatierra calls that God's affirmative action. That we're going to honor those parts of our body that have been dishonored, historically dishonored, right? Even as we were writing, all people are created equal. We got folks that own people and sell them on street corners. We got, in the Dred Scott case, we said that black folks don't have any rights that white people have to recognize. Over and over, we've said some lives matter more than others. And so now to be able to say Black Lives Matter is not saying white lives don't matter. It's not saying Black Lives Matter more. It's a way of affirming what hundreds of years of history has betrayed. So I like how there's one comedian that said, if your spouse comes up to you and says, honey, do you love me? You don't say, baby, I love everybody. And many people who want to say all lives matter, who have a hard time saying that black or brown or indigenous or gay or trans lives matter. Like, part of the problem with that is if we can't say that the most dishonored people in our society matter and are made in the image of God, we don't mean all lives matter. So it's a little bit more than your meritocracy, but let me just stop there. I want to stop there. Yeah.
Other questions or comments?
I'm curious about your community, and it started out with this little incubation of friends just out of college, this effort to serve the needs of folks living in a church, and the evolution of that. Who's with you now, and who are these people who have come and joined you, and who is the Simple Way now?
Yeah, cool. Well, I was telling a few folks, after about 25 years there, my wife and I have been taking a year to hang out with our family because we've been so anchored in Philly that we've not spent as much. I'm an only child and an only grandchild, just so you know. I'm throwing it all out there. I'm a mama's boy, and I'm not ashamed of it. And so we've been hanging out with them a little bit, and we've been living off of a school bus turned into a tiny house with solar panels and a composting toilet. I'll tell you more about that later if you want to know. But, it's been really incredible. We've been hanging out. So everything in Philly, we've still got our house in Philly. We've got, what it's happened is it's turned less into one intentional community where we all live like 10, 12 people in a house. And now it's more of a village. But we still have ways that we share stuff together, those like neighborhood celebrations. We've been doing a lot around COVID. We've got a lot of outdoor space like the gardens, so we've been vaccinating people outside because some folks have, they travel with stuff. They've got dogs or shopping carts and aren't able to come inside places very easily. So we've been taking the vaccinations into the streets, and my neighbors have been delivering food bags to seniors and taking care of each other. So all of that stuff, the affordable housing, it's just born out of living there, and it's all within kind of walking distance. And that's one of the things I would say is we also have kind of a theology of place, right? That this is a neighborhood, and part of what strikes me as I read Scripture is that Jesus lived in real places, you know, like Bethany. These little proper nouns in the gospel, they were real places, and sometimes we lose a sense of place, you know, and places have meaning. Ferguson means something. Selma means something, you know, and sometimes you go to those places. Like I went to the Holy Land, went to Capernaum. I don't know if you've been to Capernaum, but it was like, this is it? You know, there are 400 families that lived in Capernaum. You're like, this is holy ground, but it's also a little bitty town, you know? And so that's, you know, we kind of claim that sense of our neighborhood, and we really believe in that, you know, that kind of creating a neighborhood together. There's other, you know, when it comes to economics too, I'd say our ways of sharing have become a little bit more intricate. So one of the things that we started doing was tithing into a common fund that we use anytime there's a crisis or an emergency, or a need that we have. So literally, like the early church pulled their money together. We've been doing that for about 10 years and given, you know, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of dollars away now. So like whenever our corner store was broken into, we were able to replenish what they lost from that common fund. We pay for funerals out of that common fund. We get dentures out of that common fund. We've sent kids to college from that fund. So I think sometimes the church just needs imagination, you know, as we think about what does it look like to share money together in a relational way. And that's some of what we've been doing. For a while we did medical coverage like that. None of us had health insurance, so we had to figure out a way that we would share medical bills together. So, yeah, that's some of what we're up to. Yeah, if you're out in Philly, come see us sometime. I think we got one or two more. Is that all right?
We got time for one more question?
And then, by the way, I'm going to hang out at the book table. I only sign books as an excuse to make new friends, so just come say hi, even if you don't want to buy a book. But one more I think we got.
Anyone else? Oh, yes.
I just wondered how many people live in the community and what's the economic base there, where do they work, and outside funds helping you and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a softball pitch. If you'd like to support us, we love it, thesimpleWay.org. But anyway, we like pull our money together. We have always done sort of hybrid work, part-time jobs, you know, volunteer, part-time in the neighborhood. A lot of my neighbors are like, we say that our community is made up of three groups of people: remainers, returners, and relocators. And this is language of one of my mentors, John Perkins. And remainers are people that are from the neighborhood, that have lived in the neighborhood longer than I have. And they remain because they believe in the dignity of their neighborhood, and they're staying there. So those are some of our block captains and elders and neighbors. And then there's returners, folks that grew up in the neighborhood and don't want to forget where they came from. So maybe they go to college or they go to trade school or become a carpenter, and they still bring their skills back to the neighborhood. And then relocators, folks like me that are not indigenous from the neighborhood, but we've moved in there with the right posture to listen and learn and build the neighborhood together. So that's helpful language for us, you know, remainers, returners, and relocators. And I think that's kind of how we think of community. And then there's all kinds of different jobs that we have. And I write books and pull that money into the community too. So whenever you know, get books, that I have a living stipend that my annual income is set at a certain amount, similar to my neighbors, and then all of the income that we generate from speaking and writing and stuff goes in there. But everybody's contributing, you know, and we've got folks that do all kinds of different work. And I like that quote of Frederick Buechner where he said, we've got to take our passions and connect them to the world's pain. And when, you know, so we've got, you know, missional plumbers. We had a plumber that came to our neighborhood that was like, listen, I've been a plumber my whole life. I got enough money. I don't need any more money, but give me a list of who needs plumbing help in the neighborhood, and I'll be a missionary for a year. We're like, we might need more than a year, brother. we started making that list and checking it twice. And he's going to every house, like fixing plumbing. I mean, it was an amazing gift to have a plumber that was just like, I'm here for you, you know? So I think that's maybe a good place to close, is just to say, whatever our gifts are, we're all wired differently. We've got different skills. Some people can generate money. Some people can fix things, you know, in ways we can't imagine. And, you know, others got a love for the earth and for gardening. And so all of us, I think, have that invitation to say, where do my gifts meet the world's pain? You know, how can I use my gifts and my skills and resources in a way that contribute to the dream of God coming on earth as it is in heaven? So thanks so much. Amen.
Thank you so much. Friends, thanks so much for being here this evening. I want to give us plenty of time to grab some books. The books will be here after Compline as well, as will Shane. So we have just a few minutes to clear off our tables and make our way down to the nave. Compline begins promptly at 8 o'clock and is very short. If you have not joined this wonderful service of prayer, I encourage you to do so. And then stop off on your way out and buy a book to support this wonderful community.